welcome to another episode of the Close Read, the Claremont Review of Books podcast, in which I sit down with various authors from each new issue of the CRB to discuss follow-up questions from some of the work that they've sent to us. This time around, we are continuing with our series on the fall 2020 issue of the CRB, and it's my pleasure to be joined by Dr. Robert Royle. He's president of the Faith and Reason Institute, and he edits a series called The Catholic Thing, which can be found at thecatholicthing.org. The essay that we're here to discuss is called Discovering Columbus, and it's adapted from the introduction to Dr. Royle's new book, Columbus and the Crisis of the West, which you can find on Amazon. Columbus, obviously a figure much in the news at the moment as a new convulsion of anti-Western and anti-American sentiment rocks its way across the country and indeed the world. That's part of the framing of this essay, but it's also a searching look at history and human nature and the nuance and complexity required to fully take the measure of a culture, of an individual, of a historical moment. I'll read just a portion of it now, and then we will launch into our conversation with Dr. Royle. He says, during the 1992 quincentenary of Columbus' first voyage, many of us who had tried to think through what it meant, both good and bad, found it difficult to say anything positive about it in print, on television and radio, or even in academic settings without being scolded. More than 3 decades later, scholars have done what they are meant to do, uncover even more of the rich, inspiring, frightening, appalling, glorious, and inglorious features of the age of discovery. But there exists something approaching a taboo about saying anything positive about Columbus or any of the other European explorers. People ready to condemn him for every ill that has occurred on these shores, strangely, would never think of crediting him with the many goods that have been achieved as well. And it would not be stretching things to say that the blanket rejection of Columbus has become something of a poorly informed metaphor for the repudiation of virtually all of Western history. Dr. Royle, as you mentioned, you've been writing and thinking about Columbus at least since 1992 with the release of your first book on the subject. And you note here the sort of what seems to me from the outside like a rapid acceleration of the politicization of his history. I mean, as you mentioned, that it was going on already in 92. It seems as if we've seen just a drastic uptick in the kind of dynamics you describe. Is that the case, first of all? And second of all, has that surprised you as a scholar of Columbus in the Age of Discovery?
Yeah, I have to say it has. As much as I was appalled at the unwillingness to listen, reasonably to real history about the age of exploration back in 1992. On Columbus Day 1992, I actually gave a lecture at Princeton University to about 150 people of all sorts of different backgrounds, a typical academic lecture. When I was finished, some people disputed certain points that I made. Others were even more blanket in kind of rejecting my whole approach. Others supported me or added other things. But it was an academic lecture, and we had different points of view, and I presented mine, and I walked out of there unmolested, perfectly fine.
Sure.
And I probably spoke after that to pretty close to 24 colleges and universities all over the country on the subject. As we know, today that would be utterly impossible. The idea that Princeton University would be willing to host someone who, my book is not an entirely blanket defense of Columbus. It really tries to grapple with some of the difficulties of what he experienced and, where he went wrong, because he really wasn't all that good a governor on land. He was a great explorer.
Sure.
But I try to grapple, as you know, having read that it's a complex history. And the fact that we've gone so quickly from being able to actually debate this at the highest levels of our academic institutions to an absolute cancellation of any real discussion, I wouldn't have anticipated. And maybe even as little as 10 years ago, I can't say for sure, but maybe even 10 years ago, maybe I could give that lecture again. Now, no.
Do you have any speculation about the cause of that? I mean, obviously the proximate cause, I think, is the death of George Floyd and the subsequent unrest. But it seems as if it must have been the case that there were factors at play, that were things brewing before that moment. Do you have any speculation about why in those 10 years things have so suddenly accelerated?
Well, in my first book, I had already looked at what was happening in education, and there was already kind of a soft political correctness. We're back in the early 90s. It's the beginning of the Clinton years in politics, and there's a little bit of a turn toward the left. But I think what really started to happen is that from the earliest levels of grade school education up to university education, there really was an effort at, I don't think it's too strong to say this, infiltration and indoctrination. And it's mostly this kind of Howard Zinn, People's History of the United States, look at the United States as embodying everything that's absolutely wrong in the world, capitalism and racism, sexism, I mean, all these things that actually existed in the New World among the native people.
Sure.
We now have this myth we're brought here somehow by, Western civilization.
Right.
And I think that working through the system for a couple of generations, really. I mean, but I saw those young kids stomping on Columbus statues earlier this year.
Right.
I mean, it made me sick to my stomach because I've really tried to be truthful about what is good and what is bad in that record of the age of exploration. But I knew that they weren't to blame. I mean, they weren't the ones that come up with these phrases. What you often hear from parents is their kids have been studying Columbus, the age of exploration. Dad, Dad says, well, what did you learn today? Well, Columbus was a genocidal maniac.
Right.
But no real historian believes that Columbus attempted or intended to attempt a genocide. One of my editors at the Catholic thing was from Columbus, Ohio. And on Columbus Day this year, he went and he looked up. He was angry because the mayor of Columbus had removed this statue that the city of Genoa had given to Columbus, sort of one of these sister cities projects. And he had removed it and put it in a museum. So he looked up Columbus, and of course he saw that in Wikipedia that Columbus had perpetrated genocide against the Taino tribe, which was the first native groups that he had encountered. And actually, the truth be told, he was actually rather friendly with them. But anyway, my friend Brad goes to the Wikipedia entry about the Tainos, and there's no mention of a genocide because there wasn't any genocide.
Wow.
But that sort of thing has been in the bloodstream in our educational system for probably 30 years and maybe even a little bit longer. And eventually that has an effect. It becomes, just as we're starting to see now this movement to even cancel people like Jefferson and Washington for, they were slave owners. And of course, we don't celebrate them for that. But they were far more than that. And it was the parts of them that make it possible for us to be self-critical and many of the good things that have happened in the Americas that we celebrate them for. So Columbus has become caught up in that broader movement. And one of the things that worries me very much is that this really goes back to the beginning of our civilization here in the Americas. And the perfect symbol of this is we're not setting up Indigenous Peoples' Days on some other date so that we can celebrate people that formerly were excluded or oppressed. We're replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day in many jurisdictions. Mine here outside of Washington, D.C. just did that this past year. And that signals to me that we're not trying to be more exclusive. What we're doing actually is excluding parts of our Western heritage in the name of inclusion. And it's a far different spirit than it presents itself as.
Indeed. I think the latest proposition is the Day of Indigenous Rage. I saw that floating around a little bit this year. And you're making me think, I may be getting this wrong, but I think in The Sopranos, there's a scene in which Tony's kid comes home and says exactly what you've just described. And it's sort of prescient, that show always oddly prescient and observant about American culture. But I want to ask you about, in some senses, I guess, the philosophical and the theological underpinning of your own assessment of Columbus. Because in the course of making the case that you've just summarized about the anti-Columbus spirit, you also give what you think is a more measured, and I agree, sort of more measured view. It seems to me predicated on a fairly bleak view of human nature generally, or at least a realism about, just kind of the way human societies tend to go. And that's, makes you more clear-eyed about, say, the Aztecs, but any number of other, indigenous peoples. And it's against that backdrop that you measure other human achievement and, either assign praise or blame where it's due. Is this, I share this view of human nature. I think it's a distinctively Christian one, or at least, it evolves within Christendom. And I wonder whether it's possible to approach history in the way that you approach it without a Christian approach. Let's imagine somebody that comes to this as a sort of self-understood, reasonable secularist. Is it only Christianity that gives the tools for reading history in this way, do you think?
Well, it's a big question, and I don't know that I have an easy answer for it. But look, I would put it this way, just to begin here.
Right.
One of the reasons why I think it's so distressing that there was this cancel culture, there's nothing wrong with being self-critical. I think that's one of the distinctive features of our Western civilization. But
sure.
To be self-critical without being suicidal is extremely important. I think it's true to say that Christian civilization, the biblical civilization, including Judaism, is the only civilization that I'm aware of that actually believes that every human being is made in the image and likeness of God. I don't think that any other civilization has ever said that strongly. And that is one of the deep reasons why we can look at even the failures of people who come out of that tradition in the past and say they should have been more sensitive to what was going on. I agree with that. I don't give Columbus a pass because he existed in 1492.
Right.
But look, it's possible, I think, for a reasonable person to recognize that when we look at human beings, we're going to see, if you don't want to call it sinfulness, we're going to see errors, and we're going to see breakdowns, and we're going to see biases. And the way we have to live together, and this is another part of our biblical tradition, is we have to be forgiving of one another. We have to be engaged in dialogue and try to, where possible, be reasonable with one another. Where someone is just being violent and destructive, and we restrain them by the law. But to recognize that means that we're not going to be able to look at any period in history, including our own, and expect to be able to say, yeah, well, we've got the absolute answer and everybody else before us has been wrong. I joke about this somewhat. But if you look at, say, let's just pick tolerance toward homosexuals.
Sure.
As far as I can recall, it's only in the second Obama administration that Obama and Joe Biden decided that gay marriage was okay.
Right.
So were they, going back before, say, 2014, just horribly, prejudiced and to be canceled and never to be, celebrated, and nothing good ever came out of them? We have to look at human beings and try to understand that there are going to be limits, including limits on ourselves in our own appreciation of others. So, when we look back at Jefferson, we don't just look at Jefferson as solely a slave owner. We look at him as the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence.
Sure.
That we've been endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. That is a bedrock foundation for us in America, and I think more broadly in Western civilization. You maybe can find some way to justify that type of respect for human beings out of secular or other traditions, but ours comes directly out of that belief that a Creator gave us, and a Creator who's the foundation of all things, gave us liberties and gave us responsibilities, et cetera. So, yeah, I think that it's regrettable that we're getting these particular people being criticized. But you rightly point to there's a much more profound sort of philosophical, theological platform behind that is very disturbing. And once we throw out the Western heritage, by the way, I don't know on what grounds we're going to find respect for other people. We're already seeing this in the way people talk to one another on Twitter and Facebook and whatnot. That sense that the person at the other side of the internet is somehow a real human being,
right,
who deserves, if not agreement or a peaceful dialogue, at least deserves a certain amount of respect and not just immediate criticism or dismissal.
Indeed. It's one of the remarkable dimensions of what you're describing is not simply the unwillingness to discuss the nuances of history or the strong reaction against certain historical facts, but the thoroughgoing erasure of some of those complexities that you're describing. I mean, when you mention the support for gay marriage, homosexual relationships, as we speak, there are news outlets publishing headlines like Joe Biden will be the first incoming president to have an openly gay cabinet member. Just flatly untrue. I mean, Richard Grenell is an openly gay Trump cabinet member. And the Wikipedia point that you make about the Taínos is somewhat analogous. There's sort of open dishonesty. Is that a mark of ignorance, do you think, or is it a mark of something deeper and more ideological? One wonders whether one can do that with a straight face. And if so, where does that come from?
Yeah. Look, I don't know about this. I mean, we see people lie all the time in our public life about things that we know, we've lived through and we've seen on TV or listened to on radio or read newspapers. I mean, that's going on right now. And how much easier is it to falsify some historical situation that really requires you to sit down and read and think and compare interpretations and whatnot. So, look, the crux, it seems to me, is that the universities have gone bad on these things, because it's at the universities that the tone first gets set. And instead, what has happened is this kind of woke campus culture has moved, I think, with remarkable speed. I mean, we talked about that earlier, remarkable speed into journalism. And then it's moved out into public where people just are terrified.
Right.
And even liberal professors on college campuses are terrified to say what they actually think if they've got kind of complex views about something in the past.
Sure.
And so with that kind of process underway, I don't know how we make much headway. I mean, you can, through politics and through activities, you can kind of move things a bit, but the mind of the culture, the kinds of things that people really need to realize are profound and need to be studied carefully and need to be cherished, because things can get a lot worse. People think that progress kind of happens automatically these days, but we've had a tremendously good run in the Americas.
Yes,
and I'm absolutely serious when I say that if you're going to blame Columbus for everything that happened in the last 500 years. We have to say some tremendously good things have happened, even for minority groups on these shores. So we need to keep that perspective clear, and we need to understand that history is not neat. It can go backward as well as it can go forward.
Indeed. I have a sort of a strategic question about this, which is that, when you mention Twitter and when you describe what I think is, when you quite accurately depict the extremity of devotion to an anti-Western ideology, to an unmaking of sort of at least traditional account of our nation and its origins. I think a lot of listeners and a lot of conservatives in general are looking at that and saying, well, in order to fight back against that, we have to adopt our own kind of scorched earth policy and be as uncompromising in our refusal to accept, call it Marxism, call it racialism, some form of this new ideology that's we're coming up against. One of the things about your approach is that it's almost fundamentally mild-mannered. It might be fair to say, in that it genuinely aims at truth. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit to the, how it is that one can defend well what we all, I think, want to defend, which is not ideological history, but actual accuracy, precision, measured approaches to these issues. How does that approach stand up against an ideology on the warpath?
Well, I can tell you, I've been in the midst of some awful situations because of these views that I take. And I actually worry about, personally, I actually worry about security in my own home, the way people. A couple of the lectures I've given this fall, there have been some threats around the edges that fortunately have not materialized. I think what we've got to do is recognize what context we're in. Sometimes in a political context, and I want this to be understood properly, I think intransigence is the proper stance because otherwise, I've known since I was an undergraduate at an Ivy League institution that liberalism cannot stand up to radicalism. It's actually what made me a conservative.
Wow.
And there are certain places where you just have to stand up and say no. And present arguments, but don't rely too much on people being willing to listen to reason. This other approach, by doing books and articles, doing interviews like this, hoping that we get the ear of people who are willing to be intelligent human beings about what it means to live in the world, to be an individual, to be a member of a community, to be a member of a historical civilization, et cetera. I mean, that's a longer term prospect, and I don't think we can let that languish, even as we face sometimes pretty frightening opposition. And the political polarization right now, of course, hasn't helped any of us. The polarizing of both political parties to the absolute extremes is regrettable. I don't know what we can possibly do to get ourselves back to some sort of civic conversation. We can have very strong disagreements and still be, members of one society. Although it looks doubtful right now, but I think we have to hold out that possibility.
Right.
But you're right to underscore this. There are lots of situations in which you have to be a kind of a culture warrior. And
sure.
I've tried to do both in my life, and I won't say whether I've succeeded or failed, but I've done it.
Well, you make a very important point, I think, which is you do meet these people who have been listening in secret to interviews like this one or reading books and actually, had their minds changed. And there are a lot more of them out there than the people that are yelling on Twitter in point of fact. So I think approaching the issue in both ways is probably the right answer. And let me say, I'm sorry to hear about the threats to your safety. I'm sure all our audience will pray for you for your safety. I'd like to talk a little bit, if we can, about this book, because of course it goes far beyond what readers will find in the CRB, and I'm particularly curious what prompted you to write again about Columbus, having done so before, but also having published widely on a range of other issues. Why a new Columbus book, and why now?
Well, I wrote my first Columbus book back in 1992 because I did a review essay for First Things about a book that was immensely influential back then. It was called The Conquest of Paradise. It was written by a New York environmentalist called Kirkpatrick Sale. And when First Things asked me to review it, initially it was going to be a review of 1,500 words or something. But the further I got into it, I said, I've got to do a 4,000-word review of this. And so I did, and everybody said, well, you've got to write a book about this. And really, I knew only about the European part of things. I had studied in Europe and whatnot. I just knew that was wrong, and then I began to read into the other things. So that book was actually quite successful. It was called 1492 and All That. It was reviewed in the New York Review of Books, the only one of my books that has been reviewed there.
Interesting.
And the reviewer, who was a very fine scholar of the early age of exploration at Oxford, said it was regrettable that a book like this even had to be written, but it did have to be written.
Right.
Earlier in this year, I'd had several friends, and I thought this myself. I said, someday in my dotage, when I have free time and I'm not engaged in controversy anymore, I really ought to go back and rewrite 1492 and do it calmly at a time when there isn't so much controversy.
Oh, I see.
The publishers called me up and said, they'd been asking me for years to redo this book. And they said, this is the year, isn't it? So right. At the beginning of the summer, I started out, I wrote a whole bunch more. I thought through a whole bunch of things now in this new circumstance. And really now, back then it was just a debate over 1492. Really now there is a crisis in the West, I think. I don't think that's too extreme a way to put it. And we ought to just, there are crises periodically in civilizations, and civilizations don't necessarily last. I think we just have to recognize that, recognize how deep it goes. And I tried to make that clear, all through the book. I try to make clear what the issues are, what is good on the Native American side, what is good on the African American side, what the issues are in those debates and those clashes historically. But at the same time, how we have to hold the balance steady, so that what we do is really be more inclusive. Really try to bring more people into what we know is a good thing: the liberties and the prosperity, and the optimism that a place like America has been able to create throughout the world. I mean, as much as there's anti-Americanism in the world because we're the big dog everywhere we go, there also is a real admiration for a country like ours that has been able to. People think that we're xenophobic and racist and whatnot. We admit or at least before the virus, we typically admit 1 million immigrants a year into this country. And that's not a xenophobic country. That's a country that welcomes the fact that there are other people who can come here and make contributions. And we try to make that as much a part of our understanding of one another as possible. Almost all of us have relatively recent immigrant relatives somewhere or other.
Of course. Right.
And, I think that by holding that historical balance steady, we not only reflect our own core history, but I think what we recognize is what many immigrants to this country feel for why they want to come here. My wife is an immigrant, and she's a lot harsher about people who criticize this country even than I am. But she recognizes that her family had to wait in line and legally to come here, and they knew why they were coming, and they're grateful that they did.
Well, it is a remarkable feature. And actually, I think that in some respects, the returns from this most recent presidential election show some of what you're saying is true on a broader, more demographic level. In the brief time that remains to us, a question about the West as compared to America. I mean, a crisis in the viewing of Columbus and the reading of Columbus would strike one immediately as an American crisis. But you framed it as a crisis of the West. Can you say why you think it is that an American crisis should in fact be a West-wide crisis?
Well, it has to do to a great extent with what Columbus meant and means, I think. There's the easiest way to explain this is there's a reason why Vasco da Gama, the great Portuguese explorer who actually did make it to the Indies, which is where Columbus hoped to get to. There's a reason why he has never captured the imagination and been thought of as significant a figure as Columbus. And the reason is he basically traveled to other parts of the globe that were already known. If you look at medieval maps, there are 3 continents. There's Europe, there's Africa, and there's Asia. And they're all kind of jammed together, as they obviously are on our modern maps. And so you could travel from, let's say, Spain to the Indies overland. You probably wouldn't make it. You'd probably die along the way somewhere. But it was hard, and you could do it, you know. And so when da Gama goes from Portugal to the Indies, he's doing a great thing. I mean, he's an amazing explorer himself, but he's done something basically that people already knew about. Columbus coming to the New World, with his brilliance as an intuitive navigator and understanding winds, and magnetic variations on the surface of the earth, and even the irregularities on the surface of the earth. Him coming here, though, has a much more universal significance in my view, and it's this. Back in 1492, there was a lot of nervousness about calling this the Age of Exploration, or the discovery of the New World. So the powers that be came up with this term, the encounter, el encuentro in Spanish, in which cultures encountered one another. And as a kind of an article of peace, it was okay for the time. But it's not quite true, because this wasn't just an encounter. The peoples of the Americas, sure, they knew who they were. That was the point of respecting them. They knew their own lands. They had vast networks of trade and empires, and city-states, and all sorts of other things. And it's true that there was these people who, in a way, didn't need to be discovered. But it's also true that they didn't know about the rest of the world, just as the rest of the world did not know about them. And so this voyage of Columbus really begins something that we all now take for granted, and that's the fact that we all live on one world. Well, friends of mine used to tell me that when these first photographs came back from space showing the Earth as this beautiful pearl, like they're in the darkness of space, that it really brought home to them how much we all live on one planet. I think you could argue that that kind of mentality really took fire first with Columbus's first voyage in 1492. That something monumental happened to the mentality of the world, that the world had expanded, and we now not only all lived in the same world, but we all knew that we lived in this one world. So, for me, that's where the Western part of it, and only the West, I think many historians would say only the West could have carried that type of exploration out. The other civilizations that existed at the time either weren't interested or probably wouldn't have carried it out in a way that made it such a global, of such global significance. That's where the West comes out of my title. Sure.
Well, the essay, once again, is called Discovering Columbus. You can find it in the fall 2020 issue of the Claremont Review of Books. And I'm here with its author, Dr. Robert Royal. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure, Spencer.